Hey, you finally found what you were looking for. As you listen to my voice and feel the gentle frequencies in the background, you'll notice your body beginning to sink deeper into your bed. Each breath slower, each muscle softer, and with every word, your thoughts become quieter. You can let go now. You can rest. This is your journey. Welcome to Dreams of Duty. Now, before we begin this journey, take a moment just to breathe. Breathe in slowly. Feel the air fill your chest and breathe out, letting everything go. Again, breathe in and breathe out. Each time, a little deeper, a little calmer. With every breath, your body softens, your thoughts drift further away, and the world outside becomes distant and quiet. You are safe here. You are calm. You are ready to dream.
It was the 7th of July, 1937, near the outskirts of Beijing, a city that had seen centuries of dynastic power and foreign influence. The early morning mist clung to the earth, curling through the trees and low-lying fields surrounding the Marco Polo Bridge, known to the Chinese as Luguqiao. For months, tension had simmered between the Imperial Japanese Army and the Chinese troops stationed in and around the capital, a tension that had begun decades earlier with the Boxer Rebellion and Japan's increasingly aggressive incursions into Manchuria and Rihe province. The Japanese soldiers had prepared for a night exercise, a routine maneuver meant to maintain their combat readiness. Yet, they had neglected to inform the Chinese garrison positioned across the narrow canal of their planned movements. At dawn, a lone Japanese patrol, moving stealthily across the bridge, encountered a Chinese sentry. Mistaking their advance for an aggressive maneuver, the Chinese soldiers fired, igniting a sudden exchange of gunfire. The sharp cracks of rifles echoed across the river, startling birds into flight and sending ripples across the misty water. Colonel Renya Mutaguchi, commanding the Japanese detachment, was quick to react. One of his men had gone missing in the initial exchange. Though the soldier was soon found unharmed, Mutaguchi demanded that artillery be brought forward, firing on the Chinese positions with calculated precision. The Chinese troops, commanded by officers wary of escalating tensions, refused to withdraw. Both sides were acutely aware that the skirmish could serve as a catalyst for a much larger conflict. In Tokyo, the Japanese government wrestled with internal divisions. Aggressive generals like Matsui Iwane argued that Japan must take decisive action, not merely to punish the Chinese garrison, but to assert dominance over a nation they considered a puppet, one that should recognize Japanese superiority. Matsui declared, "The first point is to make the Chinese abandon the policy of depending on European countries and America. The second point is to make the Chinese people recognize that Japanese troops are the true friends of China, sacrificing themselves to save 400 million Chinese." War Minister Sugiyama Hajime promised Emperor Hirohito that the conflict would be over within 1 month. Moderates like General Ishiwara were overruled, sidelined by the momentum of hawkish militarists who sought swift victory. Japanese diplomats sent to negotiate in Nanjing were detained by their own army before they could reach the Chinese capital, a clear indication of the military's autonomy from civilian oversight. Meanwhile, in China, Chiang Kai-shek faced a nation both politically and militarily divided. Though theoretically unified under the Nationalist Party since 1928, the reality was fractured. Regional warlords commanded loyalty from their provinces, and many militias operated independently, their training and equipment inconsistent at best. Chiang's advisors, including Xu Yongcheng, counseled caution. If one can stomach it, Xu advised, it would be best to make the utmost effort to stomach Japan. Because if a major war breaks out, regardless of foreign intervention, both sides will suffer catastrophic losses. And everting this man, Chiang's mind was torn. He had previously prioritized the suppression of communist forces within China. Yet now the Japanese threat demanded immediate attention. If China was to survive, it could not simply defer confrontation. International support was imperative, but uncertain. Germany, seeking influence in Asia while maintaining ties with Japan, provided military training and equipment, while the Soviet Union supplied aircraft, pilots, and ground crews to equip divisions loyal to Chiang. On the ground, Chinese troops were a patchwork of loyalty and competence. The Nationalist Corps consisted of approximately 300,000 well-trained soldiers directly under Chiang's command, while regional armies and militias made up the remainder of the 1,800,000 troops nominally available. The communist forces, numbering around 50,000 under Mao Zedong, agreed to cooperate with the nationalists, creating an uneasy alliance against a common foe. The Japanese, by contrast, were well prepared. Approximately 600,000 soldiers were deployed to China in 1937, supported by a navy and air force that dwarfed the Chinese capabilities. Artillery, tanks, and superior logistics gave them a decisive edge in any conventional engagement. Analysts estimated that a single Japanese division could wield 3 to 12 times the combat power of a comparable Chinese unit. The skirmish at Marco Polo Bridge quickly escalated. On the 27th of July, Japanese forces launched a broader offensive in northern China, advancing along railway lines to secure strategic cities such as Zhengzhou, Nanjing, and through Chahar Province. Resistance was sporadic. Poorly organized warlord militias and communist units offered only minor obstacles. Beijing fell on the 28th of July, its historic streets and alleys subdued under the disciplined march of Japanese troops. Nationalist units fought where possible, but avoided outright annihilation. At Pingxing-1, communist forces under Lin Biao launched a rear attack on Japanese units, achieving a modest but symbolic victory. Despite the rapid territorial gains, Japanese commanders faced logistical and strategic constraints. The vastness of northern China, combined with the limitations of troop numbers, prevented a comprehensive occupation. Japanese generals debated whether to consolidate gains or push further south toward economic hubs. Chiang Kai-shek, perceiving the opportunity to divert Japanese attention, opened a new front in Shanghai. The urban environment of Shanghai offered tactical advantages for defense. Rivers, canals, and densely packed streets allowed Chinese forces to slow the Japanese advance and draw international attention. Chiang sought to leverage the presence of foreign concessions to invite potential intervention by Western powers. On the 13th of August, hostilities broke out in Shanghai. Japanese naval artillery bombarded Chinese positions, while tens of thousands of civilians sought shelter within the international settlements. The ensuing battle, which continued through September, October, and November, became the largest engagement in the region before the battles of Stalingrad. Chinese forces, including German-trained divisions, defended key urban positions with resilience. Yet, mistakes in coordination and overwhelming Japanese firepower led to heavy casualties. Black Saturday, an accidental bombing of the international settlement, killed over 1,000 civilians and foreign residents, illustrating the chaos of modern urban warfare. The battle exacted a heavy toll. Chinese losses numbered between 187,000 and 250,000 killed and wounded, while Japanese casualties ranged from 40,000 to 100,000. Despite the defeat, Chinese resistance had a galvanizing effect on national unity and international perception. The Soviet Union began to supply additional military aid, while German support became secondary, constrained by its relationship with Japan. By the end of 1937, the conflict had escalated beyond a localized border incident into a full-scale war. Japanese forces occupied much of northern and eastern China, yet control remained tenuous outside cities and along railway lines. The stage for the broader conflict of World War II in Asia was now firmly set. China, battered yet unbroken, prepared for a protracted struggle. With Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong's uneasy alliance, symbolizing the nation's determination to resist foreign domination. Refugees numbered in the tens of millions. Cities lay in ruins, and the world watched closely as the first shots of Asia's global conflict had been fired. By the end of July 1937, the skirmish at Marco Polo Bridge had ignited a full-scale conflict across northern China. Japanese military planners, emboldened by the initial success and confident in their superior training and firepower, prepared to expand their operations into the vast provinces of Hebei, Shanxi, Chahar, Jili, and Shandong. The offensive, coordinated along major railway lines, leveraged Japan's logistical advantage, ensuring the rapid movement of infantry, artillery, and supplies across distances that would have stymied the Chinese defenders. Northern China, with its rolling hills, fertile plains, and winding rivers, presented both opportunities and challenges for the invading forces. The terrain along the railway corridors was relatively open, allowing mechanized units and infantry columns to advance with speed. Yet, beyond the lines of iron and steel, the countryside consisted of villages interspersed with forests, river valleys, and patchwork farmland. Here, Chinese militias, warlord forces, and communist detachments employed guerrilla tactics, striking swiftly and retreating into the cover of dense woods and hidden villages. Japanese units advanced in carefully organized formations. Infantry marched in disciplined ranks, supported by light artillery batteries and the occasional armored car. Despite the intimidating display of strength, the Japanese faced logistical hurdles. Northern China's rail network, though extensive, had been partially sabotaged by retreating Chinese engineers, and supplies had to be guarded carefully against both ambush and sabotage. Japanese engineers worked tirelessly to repair tracks, bridge rivers, and maintain communication lines under the constant threat of insurgent attacks. The Chinese defenders, though outnumbered and often poorly equipped, utilized the terrain effectively. At strategic river crossings, makeshift fortifications and hidden artillery positions delayed the Japanese advance. In Shahar Province, militia units set fire to grain stores along supply routes, forcing Japanese units to slow their advance to secure provisions. Despite the disparity in conventional strength, these acts of resistance demonstrated the ingenuity and resilience of local forces. Nationalist forces loyal to Chiang Kai-shek concentrated their best-trained units near key provincial capitals. In Zhengzhou, approximately 100,000 troops, including German-trained divisions, prepared defensive positions along the railway and riverbanks. Artillery emplacements were camouflaged among orchards and farmland, and machine gun nests were integrated into the city's existing infrastructure. The Nationalist Command hoped to delay the Japanese advance, buying time to mobilize reserves and coordinate with communist units operating in the hinterlands. Meanwhile, communist forces under Lin Biao and his subordinates executed a series of rear attacks against Japanese columns. Their tactics relied on speed, stealth, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Villages sympathetic to the communist cause provided food, shelter, and intelligence, allowing small units to strike supply trains and isolated patrols before vanishing into the countryside. These actions, though limited in scope, forced Japanese commanders to divert resources to guard against irregular threats, illustrating that even a numerically inferior force could complicate operations across a vast territory. Japanese air support, a significant advantage over the Chinese defenders, provided reconnaissance and occasional bombardments of suspected strongholds. Pilots in Mitsubishi Ki-21 bombers and Nakajima Ki-27 fighters scoured the plains and hills, identifying concentrations of troops and directing artillery fire. Despite their skill, the vastness of northern China meant that air power could never be applied uniformly, and Japanese units sometimes advanced into ambushes from concealed Chinese positions. The capture of Beijing on the 28th of July marked a symbolic victory for the Japanese. The historic city, with its centuries-old architecture, grand gates, and administrative buildings, fell under Japanese control with relative speed. Yet, outside the city, resistance persisted. Warlord armies and regional militias, motivated by local loyalty and the desire to defend their lands, continued to harass Japanese columns, slowing their progress and inflicting casualties. By August, Japanese forces began a methodical sweep through Shanxi and Hebei provinces. Infantry divisions, supported by mechanized units and artillery, advanced along the railways, while engineers repaired tracks to maintain supply lines. In Shanxi, villages and farmland were often abandoned in the wake of advancing troops, leaving the Japanese to secure territory with minimal local support. The harsh winter approaching in the north would later compound the difficulties of occupation. But for now, the Japanese momentum seemed unstoppable. Chinese nationalist commanders faced agonizing decisions. The disparate loyalty of regional armies complicated coordination. Warlords were hesitant to commit their forces fully, fearing that a heavy engagement might leave their home territories vulnerable. Meanwhile, communist units continued their guerrilla operations, striking Japanese patrols, attacking supply convoys, and sabotaging infrastructure. Though limited in numbers, their actions demonstrated that the Japanese advance, while powerful, could never be entirely uncontested. In towns along the Japanese route, the civilian population faced profound uncertainty. Farmers abandoned homes, merchants shuttered shops, and families fled to secondary roads and rural hideaways. Refugees moved in tens of thousands, creating strain on limited resources and increasing the risk of disease and starvation. Local administrators, both Chinese and foreign, attempted to organize humanitarian relief, but the speed of the Japanese advance and the chaotic movements of troops made coordination nearly impossible. On the 27th of July, concurrent with the Japanese offensive, Chiang Kai-shek's government issued a public declaration urging unity and resistance. Radio broadcasts and leaflets encouraged all Chinese citizens to support the nationalist cause and warned against collaboration with the invaders. Propaganda emphasized the existential nature of the struggle, framing it as not merely a territorial dispute, but a battle for the survival of the nation. Despite the chaos, notable instances of strategic foresight emerged. Chiang and his advisors recognized that the northern provinces, while important, were secondary to the defense of China's economic heartlands along the Yangtze River. By forcing the Japanese to commit forces in northern China, Chiang hoped to draw attention away from key urban centers like Shanghai and Nanjing. The strategy was clear: delay, resist, and buy time for broader mobilization. Japanese commanders, on their part, were not complacent. General Hisaichi Terauchi pushed troops to their limits, determined to secure territorial gains and demonstrate Japan's military superiority. Reports of Chinese resistance and sporadic successes by communist units were met with frustration and renewed directives to maintain relentless pressure. Between September and December, Japanese divisions captured the capitals of several northern provinces, consolidating control over key railways and population centers. Amid this, the human cost continued to rise. Civilians were caught between advancing Japanese columns and retreating Chinese forces. Entire villages were depopulated as families fled into forests and along riverbanks. Disease and hunger compounded the suffering, and local medical facilities were overwhelmed. In some areas, Japanese troops engaged in punitive measures against villages suspected of harboring resistance fighters, further exacerbating civilian hardship. By the end of the year, the North China campaign had transformed from a localized skirmish into a full-scale military theater. Japanese forces controlled much of the northern rail corridors and provincial capitals, yet their hold over the countryside remained precarious. Chinese forces, both nationalist and communist, had proven capable of harassment, sabotage, and limited victories, ensuring that the conflict would not be a swift conquest. Northern China, with its vast landscapes, resilient population, and patchwork of military forces, had become a proving ground for strategies, both conventional and guerrilla. The lessons learned in these early months would shape subsequent campaigns and influence the broader course of the Second Sino-Japanese War. The spark at Marco Polo Bridge had ignited a wildfire, and the northern provinces were now the first battlegrounds where the future of China and its resistance would be forged. As the northern provinces of China burned under the Japanese offensive, Chiang Kai-shek faced an increasingly complex strategic and political dilemma. The Chinese state had been unified in name since 1928, but in reality, the nationalist government controlled only portions of the country effectively. Regional warlords maintained autonomy over their territories, and decades of civil strife had left the country fragmented. Meanwhile, the Communist Party, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, maintained a separate army and governed areas in northern and central China. For years, nationalists and communists had fought bitterly in a civil war, but the Japanese invasion created a common enemy, compelling a fragile and uneasy coordination between the two factions. By August 1937, Chiang had issued directives calling for joint operations against Japanese forces. Nationalist generals were instructed to integrate with communist units where feasible, particularly in strategic defensive positions along railways, river crossings, and key provincial capitals. Despite the orders, the practical realities of cooperation were challenging. Nationalist officers, trained in German tactics and disciplined in conventional warfare, often viewed the guerrilla-style communist units with suspicion. Mao's troops, skilled in hit-and-run attacks, ambushes, and sabotage, distrusted Chiang's leadership, fearing that integration would dilute their operational effectiveness. In Hebei province, a significant experiment in coordination took place. Nationalist divisions under General He Ying-chin took positions along the Beiping-Shanhaiguan railway line, while communist detachments commanded by Lin Biao and Nie Rongzhen patrolled the surrounding countryside. The communists conducted raids against Japanese supply convoys, destroyed rail bridges, and ambushed isolated patrols. Meanwhile, nationalist artillery units provided suppressive fire against Japanese forward positions, buying time for local militias to regroup and reinforce weak defensive points. The results were mixed. While some operations demonstrated the effectiveness of combined action, clashes in command style and disagreements over tactical priorities frequently hindered coordinated responses. Despite these difficulties, the situation forced both sides to adapt. The Nationalist Army began assigning liaison officers to communist units, providing a direct channel for communication and coordination. These officers were tasked with ensuring that attacks were timed appropriately, that reinforcements could be requested without confusion, and that intelligence gathered by communist scouts was shared with nationalist headquarters. For the communists, the experience offered exposure to heavy weapons, artillery support, and conventional military organization, which complemented their existing guerrilla skills. In September, Japanese forces made significant advances toward Tianjin and the northern coast. The rapid movement threatened both nationalist and communist positions, compelling a more structured cooperation. Nationalist troops reinforced urban centers, digging trenches, fortifying buildings, and establishing barricades along key streets. Communist units patrolled surrounding hills and forests, intercepting Japanese supply lines and preparing ambushes on the approaches to the cities. The combination of urban defense and rural harassment began to slow Japanese momentum, proving that coordinated efforts, however tentative, could yield tangible results. Chiang Kai-shek, however, remained acutely aware of the political implications. Coordination with the communists was necessary militarily, but fraught politically. Integrating forces risked elevating the political influence of the Communist Party, a factor that he found deeply threatening given their long-term revolutionary goals. To mitigate this, he retained overall command, set strict operational parameters, and emphasized that all communist units were subordinate to nationalist strategic objectives. Mao and his commanders, while willing to fight the Japanese, insisted on operational autonomy, resulting in frequent negotiations over deployment, target selection, and engagement rules. Beyond military coordination, logistical cooperation was critical. The nationalists controlled much of the official supply network, including weapons, food, and medical support, while the communists often relied on local villagers and captured supplies. In joint operations, careful planning was required to prevent duplication of effort and ensure that both armies had sufficient provisions. Nationalist engineers repaired rail lines and bridges damaged by Japanese attacks, allowing supplies to reach both conventional divisions and guerrilla units. Meanwhile, communist units coordinated with local communities to establish hidden caches of food, medicine, and ammunition, ensuring sustainability in contested areas. The role of Soviet assistance was also becoming increasingly significant. By late 1937, the USSR had committed to supplying China with modern aircraft, artillery, and advisors, particularly to nationalist units. Soviet pilots and technicians trained nationalist aviators and supported early aerial operations against Japanese forces. Communist forces received some of this material indirectly, using the weapons in guerrilla operations. The shared benefit of Soviet aid provided an additional incentive for cooperation, although trust between nationalists and communists remained fragile. In urban areas such as Tianjin and the outskirts of Beijing, coordination between the two forces also had a humanitarian dimension. Civilians caught between advancing Japanese troops and defending Chinese units faced displacement, starvation, and disease. Both nationalist and communist commanders implemented measures to organize refugee movements, distribute food and medical care, and establish temporary shelters. Yet, the scale of the crisis often overwhelmed efforts, leaving thousands dependent on local volunteers and international relief organizations. By November 1937, the northern provinces had become a theater of complex operations. Japanese forces controlled provincial capitals, railways, and major towns, but they faced persistent resistance in rural areas, forests, and along rivers. Nationalist troops defended cities in conventional formations, while communist units waged guerrilla campaigns in the surrounding countryside. The integration of these two approaches, although imperfect, began to show strategic potential. Japanese supply lines were continuously harassed, communications disrupted, and isolated units forced to operate cautiously, reducing the overall tempo of the offensive. Chiang Kai-shek, reflecting on these developments, recognized both the promise and peril of the alliance. Militarily, combined nationalist-communist operations had slowed the Japanese advance and allowed key cities to remain in Chinese hands longer than anticipated. Politically, the cooperation was a delicate balancing act. Too much integration risked empowering the communists. Too little risked military failure. The situation demanded constant negotiation, careful planning, and a shared commitment to the broader goal of resisting Japanese aggression. At the end of 1937, the North China Campaign, coupled with the early stages of joint nationalist-communist operations, had laid the foundation for a protracted conflict. The war was no longer a series of isolated skirmishes. It had become a national struggle, encompassing urban centers, rural hinterlands, and strategic supply lines. Coordination between the two major Chinese factions, though fraught with tension, had become essential. The stage was set for a prolonged conflict in which strategy, political maneuvering, and the will to resist would determine the fate of millions. By August 1937, the war had fully spread to the Yangtze River Delta, and the city of Shanghai had become the focal point of Chinese resistance against Japanese expansion. Shanghai, one of China's most important economic hubs, was a sprawling metropolis with a population exceeding 3 million, including thousands of foreign residents living in the international settlement. The city's dense urban landscape, with its narrow alleyways, wide boulevards, rivers, canals, and multi-story buildings, made it a highly defensible location, but also a potential death trap for civilians caught in the crossfire. Chiang Kai-shek had committed some of his best-trained German-equipped divisions to the defense of Shanghai, recognizing that the city's economic and symbolic significance made it worth defending at almost any cost. The nationalist strategy relied on holding key urban districts, while forcing the Japanese into a drawn-out battle that would stretch their supply lines and increase casualties. Defensive positions were established in office buildings, warehouses, and fortified compounds, with barricades constructed across major streets to impede Japanese armored advances. Artillery units were placed on rooftops and along embankments to provide enfilading fire, while machine gun nests covered intersections and bridges. Japanese forces, having secured substantial victories in northern China, brought approximately 200,000 troops to the Shanghai theater. The army coordinated closely with the Imperial Navy, which maintained control of the Huangpu River and provided gunfire support to landing operations. The Japanese Air Force, deploying a mix of bombers and fighters, conducted precision strikes on defensive positions while attempting to minimize international diplomatic incidents in the international settlement. Yet, despite Japan's superiority in numbers, equipment, and air power, the urban environment posed new tactical challenges that differed significantly from the open plains of northern China. Skirmishing began on August 13th. Japanese naval artillery opened fire from positions along the Huangpu River, targeting nationalist fortifications and concentrations of troops. The bombardment was supplemented by aerial reconnaissance and bombing, designed to disrupt command and control and weaken morale. Despite the initial shock, Chinese troops held their ground, employing urban defensive tactics learned from previous engagements, and fortified the southern districts where canals and smaller rivers provided natural barriers. One tragic incident, later remembered as Black Saturday, occurred on August 14th. Chinese artillery units, attempting to strike the Japanese cruiser Izuma, miscalculated their targeting and accidentally shelled the international settlement. The bombardment resulted in over 1,000 civilian casualties, including both local residents and foreign nationals. Flames consumed buildings, cars, and warehouses, and rescue efforts were hampered by ongoing combat. Witnesses described the scene as apocalyptic. Flames from a blazing car played over distorted bodies, in shapeless heaps where they had been huddling in shelter. Bodies in coolie cloth turned scarlet lay, piled at entrances to the main doorways and arcades of the Palace and Cathay hotels. Hands, legs, and arms lay far from smashed masses of flesh. Chinese counterattacks continued on August 17th. Nationalist forces attempted to retake streets lost during initial Japanese advances, supported by artillery and limited armored vehicles, including German Panzer IS and armored cars. These units, although damaged during transit and poorly suited for Shanghai's urban terrain, provided valuable support during close-quarter engagements. Despite their efforts, Japanese forces gradually pushed forward, engaging in fierce house-to-house combat that reduced entire neighborhoods to rubble. The battle created a humanitarian crisis. Tens of thousands of civilians were trapped in the fighting, forced to seek refuge wherever possible, from makeshift shelters to the basements of bombed-out buildings. Food, clean water, and medical care were in short supply. Both nationalist and Japanese forces faced challenges in distinguishing civilians from combatants, further exacerbating casualties. International organizations and foreign residents attempted to maintain safe zones, particularly within the international settlement, but the scale of the fighting made protection incomplete and often temporary. By September, the Japanese High Command had committed additional forces, hoping to encircle the city and force a decisive victory. The Imperial Japanese Army used frontal infantry assaults, combined with naval and artillery bombardments, to capture outer districts. Chinese defenders, aware of the strategic importance of each street and bridge, implemented scorched earth policies in some areas, destroying supplies and infrastructure to deny their use to the advancing Japanese. The destruction was extensive. Warehouses, factories, and residential blocks were consumed in fire and rubble, further complicating civilian survival. The Chinese Air Force, with Soviet assistance, conducted intermittent bombing raids against Japanese positions. Pilots, flying Soviet-supplied Polikarpov I 15 and I-16 aircraft, targeted supply depots, troop concentrations, and naval vessels along the river. While unable to significantly alter the overall momentum of the battle, these operations boosted morale among defenders and demonstrated the potential of combined nationalist and Soviet military support. Urban warfare intensified in October and November. Japanese troops employed flamethrowers, grenades, and close-quarter combat tactics to dislodge defenders from fortified buildings. Street-to-street fighting involved continuous exchanges of gunfire, bayonet charges, and small unit maneuvers. Nationalist units adapted by establishing secondary defensive lines within neighborhoods, using alleys, courtyards, and canals as choke points to slow Japanese progression. Despite the tactical skill and determination of Chinese defenders, the overwhelming numbers and superior firepower of the Japanese forces gradually eroded the city's defenses. Civilian suffering reached catastrophic levels. Refugees crowded into the international settlement and other perceived safe areas, often facing shortages of food, water, and shelter. The chaos of urban combat, combined with artillery bombardments and aerial attacks, created daily casualties that numbered in the thousands. Hospitals and emergency facilities, overwhelmed by the influx of injured civilians and soldiers, struggled to provide care. The psychological toll on the population was immense. Many described the city as a living nightmare, where the line between life and death was dictated by the advance of enemy troops. By early December, the Japanese had captured the southern districts of Shanghai, forcing Chinese defenders to withdraw to northern positions. Chiang Kai-shek relocated the Central Command to safer areas outside the city. coordinating continued resistance and reinforcing troops along the periphery. Although the Japanese had secured significant portions of Shanghai, the city's defense had served strategic purposes. The drawn-out battle forced Japan to commit substantial resources, delayed further advances toward the Yangtze River Delta, and drew international attention to China's plight. The Battle of Shanghai became emblematic of China's determination to resist foreign aggression despite overwhelming odds. Chinese nationalist forces demonstrated discipline and tactical ingenuity, while communist units continued to disrupt Japanese operations in the surrounding countryside. Civilians endured unimaginable hardship, yet their survival and resilience were integral to sustaining morale and providing support to defending forces. By the end of 1937, the Battle of Shanghai had transformed from an initial Japanese offensive into a protracted siege that would influence the broader course of the Second Sino-Japanese War. The city, partially destroyed and heavily scarred, remained a symbol of Chinese resistance. The lessons learned: urban defense, coordination between disparate factions, and the mobilization of civilian populations would inform subsequent campaigns across China. The stage was set for the next phase of the war, the advance toward Nanjing, the former nationalist capital, where both military strategy and human tragedy would reach unprecedented levels. Following the bitter struggle in Shanghai, the Japanese High Command shifted its focus westward toward Nanjing, the former nationalist capital, and a city of profound political, symbolic, and logistical significance. Nanjing, nestled along the southern banks of the Yangtze River, had been the heart of the nationalist government during the Nanjing Decade, with wide boulevards, stately government buildings, schools, hospitals, and cultural institutions. Its capture promised both a decisive military victory and a psychological blow to Chinese morale, signaling Japanese dominance over the eastern provinces. In early December 1937, Japanese forces consolidated their gains from Shanghai. Approximately 200,000 soldiers, divided among the Central China Field Army under the command of General Matsui Iwane, began a methodical advance along major highways, railways, and river routes leading to Nanjing. The army was accompanied by an extensive logistics network, including armored trains, artillery units, engineers, and supply convoys. Air units conducted reconnaissance flights to monitor Chinese troop movements and to coordinate artillery strikes. Japanese naval forces patrolled the Yangtze River, securing river crossings and bombarding defensive positions along its banks. Chinese defenses, although weakened by the loss of Shanghai, were organized with a combination of nationalist and German-trained units. General Sheng Zitang commanded approximately 75,000 defenders, of whom only 20,000 were fully trained and equipped. Many of the remaining troops were hastily mobilized regional militias, poorly armed and lacking uniforms, shoes, or reliable supplies. Despite these limitations, Chinese commanders implemented a scorched earth policy, destroying bridges, cutting communication lines, and evacuating civilian populations in anticipation of Japanese occupation. The march itself was relentless. Japanese divisions moved in disciplined columns along the main roadways, supported by armored vehicles and artillery. Engineers repaired damaged bridges and rail lines as they advanced, ensuring the steady flow of supplies and reinforcements. Cavalry units scouted ahead, capturing stragglers and maintaining contact with Chinese rear units. Skirmishes occurred regularly as Chinese forces attempted ambushes, sabotage, and delaying actions. But the superior training, coordination, and firepower of the Japanese ensured that most resistance was temporary and localized. As the Japanese approached Nanjing, civilians began fleeing en masse. Refugees crowded roads, riverbanks, and makeshift camps, creating a chaotic and dangerous environment. Many attempted to cross the Yangtze River using small boats or makeshift rafts, only to be caught in the crossfire or swept away by the current. Within the city itself, tension and panic were palpable. Government offices, schools, hospitals, and residential areas were emptied, leaving only essential troops and a few remaining officials to coordinate the defense. On December 5th, Japanese units reached the outskirts of Nanjing. The initial engagement involved artillery bombardments of the outer defensive lines, followed by infantry advances. Chinese troops, entrenched in prepared positions, resisted with determination, particularly in the northern suburbs, where fortified compounds and natural barriers slowed Japanese progress. Street-to-street fighting was intense, and nationalist units attempted to counterattack in isolated pockets. Despite their valor, Chinese forces were increasingly overwhelmed by Japanese firepower, mobility, and coordination. By December 8th, the outer defensive ring had fallen. General Tang recognized the deteriorating situation and ordered a retreat to the inner city, though the withdrawal was poorly coordinated. Many troops fled in disarray, abandoning positions and leaving civilians exposed. Fires, explosions, and artillery shelling transformed streets into obstacles strewn with rubble and corpses. Japanese forces pressed forward relentlessly, seeking to encircle the remaining defenders and cut off escape routes. The inner defenses held for only a few days. On December 10th, Japanese troops breached the city's main gates and began moving through the streets with minimal organized resistance. The chaos intensified as remaining Chinese units, outnumbered and under-equipped, attempted to regroup. Many officers abandoned their posts, leaving rank-and-file soldiers and civilians to fend for themselves. Scorched earth tactics continued, with Chinese forces setting fire to warehouses, offices, and bridges to impede Japanese movements. But these measures could not prevent the inevitable occupation. On December 12th, Japanese forces fully entered Nanjing. General Tang had fled the previous day, leaving the city without centralized command. Units of the Japanese army, conditioned by years of brutal campaigns and an ideology that dehumanized the Chinese, began systematic operations to secure control. These operations quickly escalated into atrocities: mass killings of male civilians and soldiers, widespread rape of women, looting of homes and businesses, and the destruction of cultural and religious sites. Observers described streets littered with corpses, fires consuming entire neighborhoods, and a pervasive climate of terror. Refugees sought sanctuary wherever possible, with the international settlement and foreign establishments providing limited protection. John Rabe, a German businessman and Nazi Party member, attempted to organize a safety zone to shield civilians, relying on international law and the presence of Western residents to deter Japanese atrocities. Despite these efforts, the scale of violence was staggering, with estimates suggesting tens of thousands of civilians killed and thousands of women raped over the ensuing weeks. The attack on foreign vessels along the Yangtze River added an international dimension. On December 12th, Japanese aircraft and machine gunners attacked the USS Panay and accompanying oil tankers, killing 4 Americans and multiple Chinese refugees. Though the ships were clearly marked as American, the Japanese justified the action as a military necessity. Diplomatic protests followed, but the incident did not provoke war between Japan and the United States, though it signaled the rising tensions in East Asia. By the end of December 1937, Nanjing was fully under Japanese occupation. The city's fall marked both a military and psychological victory for Japan, but also highlighted the limitations of Japanese control. Large regions of the surrounding provinces remained contested or inaccessible, and Chinese resistance persisted in rural areas. The occupation inflicted profound suffering on civilians, decimated infrastructure, and left lasting scars on the national consciousness. The march to Nanjing had achieved Japanese objectives in terms of territorial gain and symbolic victory, but it also demonstrated the resilience of Chinese resistance, the strategic value of urban defense, and the potential for prolonged conflict. While the Japanese celebrated their success, Chiang Kai-shek and his remaining forces withdrew to Wuhan and Chongqing, reorganizing, training, and preparing for continued resistance. The war, far from over, had entered a new and more brutal phase, setting the stage for the protracted struggle that would define the Second Sino-Japanese War and foreshadow the wider conflagration of World War II in Asia. With the full occupation of Nanjing in mid-December 1937, the city descended into chaos and terror. Japanese forces, numbering over 200,000 and led by General Matsui Iwane, began operations to consolidate control, but their actions rapidly escalated beyond conventional military objectives. The Imperial Japanese Army, fueled by a combination of military indoctrination, prior experiences in northern China, and dehumanizing ideology, systematically targeted the civilian population and any remaining Chinese soldiers, many of whom had removed their uniforms to blend with non-combatants. The initial days of the occupation saw Japanese units entering the city from multiple axes, converging on the central administrative districts. Soldiers moved in disciplined columns, but the chaos of urban combat and the collapse of organized Chinese resistance quickly gave way to uncontrolled violence. Street after street, Japanese troops executed Chinese men, often rounding up groups based on the mere suspicion of military affiliation. Local witnesses reported bodies piled in alleys, courtyards, and public squares. The army's brutal campaign was justified internally as a method of securing the city and preventing future insurrections, but in practice, it became an indiscriminate slaughter. Rape was rampant, affecting women, children, and teenagers. Estimates suggest that approximately 1,000 women were assaulted each night during the first weeks of the occupation. Schools, hospitals, and private homes offered no refuge. Japanese soldiers would enter and perpetrate crimes against those who remained. Many victims were then executed, often in front of their families, to further terrorize the population. Survivors later recounted horrific details. Soldiers arrived in broad daylight, looting our homes, taking our money, and assaulting women. In the streets, many were bayoneted to death even in the safe zone. Outside of the zone, nobody dared to go out. John Rabe, a German businessman and Nazi Party member, residing in Nanjing, attempted to organize a safety zone in the international settlement, seeking to shelter tens of thousands of civilians. His efforts, along with those of other foreign residents, provided limited protection, yet Japanese soldiers frequently ignored boundaries, and the violence inevitably spilled into supposedly secure areas. Hospitals and relief centers became overcrowded, with medical supplies rapidly depleted. International journalists documented atrocities where possible, sending harrowing reports abroad that would later serve as evidence during post-war tribunals. The massacre was not merely spontaneous. It reflected the combination of abandoned rules of war, militarized indoctrination, and Japanese belief in racial and cultural superiority. Officers encouraged or turned a blind eye to atrocities, with some soldiers explicitly writing in diaries of their intent to kill, rape, and plunder. One soldier recounted, "I figured that I'd never get another chance like this, so I stabbed 30 people. Climbing atop the mountain of corpses, I felt like a real devil slayer, stabbing again and again with all my might. The groans of the victims, old and young, filled the air. I also borrowed a buddy's sword and tried to decapitate some." Looting accompanied the mass killings. Japanese troops stripped warehouses, businesses, and private homes of valuables, confiscated food and clothing, and destroyed infrastructure that could aid defenders or civilians. Entire neighborhoods were burned to the ground, creating an environment of fire, smoke, and ash that obscured the city's skyline and contributed to the psychological terror. The city's architectural heritage, including temples, schools, and government buildings, suffered extensive damage. During the occupation, attempts to resist or flee were met with extreme violence. Remaining Chinese soldiers who had evaded capture were hunted, and those captured were executed en masse. The chaos forced tens of thousands of civilians to attempt crossings of the Yangtze River in overcrowded boats or makeshift rafts, leading to drownings and stampedes. Japanese forces often patrolled the riverbanks, shooting at those attempting escape or commandeering the boats for military purposes. Despite the widespread destruction, pockets of organized resistance persisted. Chinese communist units in surrounding rural areas and nationalist forces regrouped beyond the city, planning future operations and maintaining morale through propaganda and local coordination. The resilience of these forces, combined with international attention on Japanese actions, prevented the complete collapse of Chinese military and civil resistance in the region. The international response was mixed. The attack on the USS Panay and other foreign vessels during the march to Nanjing had demonstrated the risk to Western lives. Yet most Western powers stopped short of direct military intervention. Diplomatic protests and public condemnation followed, but concrete actions were limited. Only the Soviet Union accelerated military aid to China, supplying additional aircraft, artillery, and advisors to strengthen the beleaguered nationalist forces. By the end of 1937, the Nanjing massacre had resulted in the deaths of an estimated 300,000 civilians and unarmed soldiers, alongside widespread sexual violence and the destruction of large portions of the city. While Japanese forces achieved a tactical victory by capturing the city, the strategic and moral consequences were significant. The atrocities galvanized Chinese resistance, deepened anti-Japanese sentiment, and ensured that future engagements would be fought with even greater resolve. The massacre marked a turning point in the Second Sino-Japanese War. Japan had demonstrated its military might, But the brutality and international attention surrounding Nanjing hardened global opinion against Japanese expansion. China, despite suffering devastating losses, emerged with a strengthened sense of national unity and purpose. The war, already expansive in scale, was far from over. The occupation of Nanjing was not the end of resistance, it was the beginning of a protracted struggle that would define the course of the Second Sino-Japanese War and shape the broader trajectory of World War II in Asia. After the fall of Nanjing in December 1937, Japanese forces faced the difficult task of consolidating control over a vast and devastated territory. While the capture of the former capital was a symbolic and tactical triumph, it exposed critical limitations in Japanese strategy. Large swaths of Jiangsu, Anhui, and surrounding provinces remained contested, populated by fleeing civilians, scattered nationalist and communist troops, and irregular militias. The Japanese army, numbering over 200,000 in central China, lacked sufficient manpower to fully garrison every town, village, and road, and supply lines stretched perilously thin. In the immediate aftermath of Nanjing, Japanese commanders focused on establishing administrative control in occupied areas. Military police units were deployed to enforce Japanese authority, confiscate weapons, and maintain order, though their presence often led to further atrocities. Civilian infrastructure had been decimated by scorched earth tactics, fires, and shelling, and the army faced the dual challenge of securing resources while continuing offensive operations. Looting, forced labor, and requisitioning of food and supplies became routine, further alienating the local population and driving many to resist by any means possible. In response to the Japanese occupation, Chinese forces adapted to the new reality through guerrilla warfare and localized resistance. Small bands of nationalist and communist soldiers, often numbering only a few hundred men, operated behind Japanese lines. These units targeted supply convoys, sabotaged railways and bridges, and ambushed isolated garrisons. The terrain of central and northern China, including forests, hills, and river valleys, proved advantageous for irregular warfare. Civilians often assisted these units, providing intelligence, shelter, and logistical support at immense personal risk. In northern China, the Japanese faced a different but equally challenging situation. The provinces of Hebei, Shanxi, and Shandong had been occupied in mid to late 1937, following the rapid advance from Beijing and Tianjin. Japanese divisions moved along the rail lines and major roads, but resistance remained fierce. Chinese warlord armies, though poorly coordinated, engaged in delaying tactics to slow the Japanese advance, allowing the evacuation of civilians and essential equipment. Guerrilla bands, operating independently or in coordination with remnants of nationalist or communist forces, harassed Japanese patrols and supply lines. The winter of 1937 to 1938 was particularly harsh. Freezing temperatures, snow-covered plains, and treacherous river crossings added to the difficulties faced by both occupying and defending forces. Japanese soldiers, trained for conventional warfare, struggled with the extended lines of communication, unfamiliar terrain, and the constant threat of ambush. Units often became isolated, requiring reinforcements and supplies to be airdropped or transported over long distances. Despite these challenges, Japanese forces sought to consolidate their hold on the north. Key cities such as Beijing, Tianjin, and Zhengzhou were fortified, with garrisons placed strategically to control transportation hubs, river crossings, and resource-rich areas. Artillery units occupied elevated positions overlooking plains and river valleys, providing both deterrence and fire support against guerrilla actions. Air reconnaissance and bombing missions were employed to locate and suppress resistance, though the scale of the territory meant that many attacks had only localized effects. Chinese strategy during this period emphasized survival, attrition, and the preservation of trained forces. Chiang Kai-shek directed his best divisions to avoid encirclement or annihilation, focusing instead on delaying actions and mobile defense. German-trained units formed the core of the Nationalist Army's response, holding critical passes and river crossings, while less experienced troops conducted harassment operations. Communist units, under leaders such as Lin Biao and Zhu Dai, coordinated sabotage and ambushes, gaining valuable combat experience that would later prove crucial in the prolonged struggle against Japan. Civilians, caught in the crossfire, endured extreme hardship. Refugee camps swelled as hundreds of thousands fled from urban centers, burned villages, and advancing armies. Food shortages, disease, and exposure created additional casualties, compounding the toll of direct combat. Nonetheless, the shared suffering fostered a sense of collective resistance, with local populations providing intelligence, shelter, and supplies to irregular units. Propaganda campaigns emphasized national unity, the illegitimacy of Japanese occupation, and the duty of every Chinese citizen to resist. By mid-1938, Japanese forces had extended their control over most of eastern China, but the occupation remained incomplete. Guerrilla operations continued to disrupt railways, ambush isolated patrols, and drain Japanese resources. The need for a sustained and substantial garrison tied down large numbers of troops, limiting the army's ability to launch further offensive operations. In some regions, Japanese commanders experimented with puppet administrations and collaborationist local leaders. Though these efforts often failed due to the population's enduring hostility, the northern campaigns highlighted the evolving nature of the Second Sino-Japanese War. Unlike the swift advances in Shanghai or Nanjing, the Japanese now faced a protracted conflict in which control of territory required not only military superiority, but also the capacity to suppress popular resistance. Chinese forces adapted to the circumstances, combining conventional and irregular tactics to maximize the impact of limited resources. The war, initially envisioned by Japanese leaders as a rapid conquest, was proving to be a grinding, attritional struggle that demanded extensive commitment of manpower, logistics, and political control. Meanwhile, international developments continued to influence the conflict. The Soviet Union, motivated by the need to counter Japanese expansion and protect its interests in Asia, increased military aid to China, sending additional aircraft, tanks, advisors, and training teams. Germany, balancing its strategic relationship with Japan, reduced direct support for Chiang's forces, but maintained a degree of influence through military advisors and arms shipments. The United States and other Western powers monitored the situation closely, providing limited aid while preparing contingency plans in case the conflict escalated further. By the end of 1938, the pattern of the war had become clear. Japanese forces held major cities, river crossings, and key transportation routes. Yet vast rural areas remained contested or under guerrilla control. Chinese resistance, while fragmented, was persistent, increasingly coordinated, and adaptable. The occupation of northern provinces and the aftermath of Nanjing demonstrated that, despite early victories, Japan faced a long and uncertain struggle, foreshadowing the protracted nature of the Second Sino-Japanese War and the broader conflict that would engulf the Asia-Pacific region in the years to come. By early 1939, the conflict between China and Japan had expanded beyond the eastern seaboard and northern plains into central and western provinces, creating a sprawling theater of war that stretched across thousands of kilometers. Japanese strategy had initially focused on capturing major cities, industrial centers, and transportation hubs, but the persistent resistance in the north and east forced a more complex operational plan. The Imperial Japanese Army sought to secure the Yangtze River Valley, the economic heartland of China, while simultaneously cutting off access to the western provinces, where nationalist and communist forces regrouped. Central China, including provinces such as Hubei, Hunan, and Henan, became the next focus of Japanese offensives. These regions were of immense strategic importance. They contained fertile farmlands, essential rail lines, and river routes critical for supply and troop movements. The Japanese launched combined arms operations, deploying infantry divisions supported by artillery, tanks, and aircraft. Despite their superior firepower, progress was slow. Chinese defenders, including German-trained nationalist divisions and communist guerrilla units, utilized riverine defenses, fortified towns, and mountain passes to delay and disrupt the Japanese advance. The city of Wuhan, comprising Wuchang, Hankou, and Hanyang, emerged as a critical stronghold. Chiang Kai-shek relocated the central government there in March 1939, recognizing both its strategic depth and industrial significance. Over 400,000 troops were assembled to defend the city, including approximately 100,000 elite nationalist soldiers, supplemented by regional militias and communist units under the temporary United Front. The Japanese, estimating that at least 5 divisions would be required for a successful capture, began a series of meticulously planned assaults that combined artillery bombardment, river crossings, and air raids. Guerrilla warfare intensified in the surrounding countryside. Local militias and communist units harassed Japanese supply lines, destroyed bridges, and ambushed isolated detachments. Mountainous regions, dense forests, and the labyrinthine river valleys provided ideal conditions for hit-and-run attacks, allowing smaller Chinese forces to inflict disproportionate casualties. Civilians, often caught between retreating nationalist troops and advancing Japanese forces, played a crucial role in providing intelligence, supplies, and shelter. The Chinese also utilized scorched earth tactics, destroying crops, rail lines, and bridges to deny the Japanese essential resources and slow their advance. In western provinces such as Sichuan and Shaanxi, the conflict took on a different character. Here, Japanese forces were limited to aerial reconnaissance and occasional cavalry raids, as the distance from coastal supply lines made sustained operations difficult. Chinese forces, including regional warlord armies and communist units, fortified key towns and river crossings, preparing for potential Japanese incursions. The mountainous terrain created natural defensive advantages, but also posed logistical challenges, forcing Chinese commanders to prioritize mobility, intelligence, and local support. The Japanese faced growing difficulties in maintaining their extended lines of communication. Railways, critical for transporting troops and supplies, were frequent targets of sabotage by Chinese guerrillas. The destruction of bridges and railway yards slowed troop movements, delayed reinforcements, and limited the operational reach of Japanese divisions. In addition, persistent resistance in rural areas required the Japanese to commit garrison troops in large numbers, diverting forces from offensive operations and straining logistical resources. By mid-1939, air power became increasingly decisive in the central and western theaters. Japanese aircraft conducted bombing raids on cities, rail yards, and industrial facilities, seeking to disrupt production and demoralize civilian populations. The Chinese, aided by Soviet-supplied aircraft and German-trained pilots, mounted air defenses and limited counterattacks. Although they could not match Japanese air superiority in scale, Chinese forces used their aircraft effectively to support ground operations, target supply lines, and conduct reconnaissance. In the urban areas of central China, civilians bore the brunt of the conflict. Refugees from Nanjing, Shanghai, and northern provinces flooded into cities such as Wuhan, Chongqing, and Xiangyang, creating overcrowded camps and humanitarian crises. Disease, malnutrition, and exposure compounded the hardships of war, yet the population demonstrated remarkable resilience. Local leaders organized relief efforts, clandestine schools, and support networks to maintain morale and survival. Propaganda campaigns encouraged continued resistance, emphasizing national unity, anti-Japanese sentiment, and the defense of family and homeland. The wars spread into central and western China also had significant political implications. Regional warlords, previously semi-independent, were pressured to align with Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government to resist Japanese incursions. The tenuous alliance with communist forces persisted, as both sides recognized the necessity of coordinated defense against the common enemy. International observers noted the strategic importance of central China as a buffer for the hinterland and a potential staging area for future operations. By late 1939, the Japanese had made limited territorial gains in central China. Cities along the Yangtze River were partially occupied, but the surrounding countryside remained contested. Guerrilla operations, scorched earth tactics, and logistical difficulties prevented the Japanese from establishing secure control. In the West, Chinese forces continued to consolidate positions, leveraging natural terrain to delay or repel any incursion. The war had become a protracted struggle, with neither side able to achieve a decisive victory in central or western provinces. The expansion of the conflict highlighted the endurance and adaptability of Chinese resistance. While Japan possessed superior firepower, training, and mobility, the vastness of the territory, the resilience of the population, and the flexibility of Chinese military strategy ensured that occupation would be costly and incomplete. The Central and Western campaigns foreshadowed a drawn-out war of attrition, shaping the conflict's trajectory through the early 1940s and setting the stage for eventual international involvement in the Second Sino-Japanese War. As the Second Sino-Japanese War expanded into central and western China, the conflict began to attract the attention of global powers. By 1939, the scale of the war, the suffering of the civilian population, and the strategic significance of China had made the conflict impossible for the world to ignore. Japan, seeking to secure its dominance over East Asia, faced increasing diplomatic scrutiny, while China, under Chiang Kai-shek, attempted to leverage international opinion and material aid to resist occupation. The Soviet Union became one of the most crucial players in China's struggle during this period. Concerned about Japanese expansion and the potential threat to Soviet territory in the Far East, Moscow began to provide extensive military aid. By early 1939, the USSR had committed thousands of advisors, several hundred aircraft, and equipment sufficient to outfit at least 30 divisions. Soviet pilots and technicians worked alongside Chinese forces, training personnel in modern aerial tactics, maintenance, and the use of mechanized units. The Soviets also supplied artillery, tanks, and machine guns, significantly enhancing the combat effectiveness of both nationalist and communist units. Germany's role remained complex and ambivalent. Despite its alliance with Japan through the Anti-Comintern Pact, Berlin maintained relations with Chiang Kai-shek, primarily to secure economic and military influence in East Asia. German advisors continued to train elite Chinese divisions, focusing on modern tactics, discipline, and combined arms operations. While Germany reduced direct arms shipments to China, its influence remained evident in the organization, strategy, and leadership of the nationalist forces. Chiang carefully balanced this relationship, seeking Soviet and German support without alienating either power. The United States and the Western European powers monitored developments closely. American missionaries, businesses, and diplomats reported atrocities, refugee crises, and Japanese advances. The United States, bound by treaties and economic interests, was cautious in its response, but public opinion increasingly favored support for China. By 1939, American officials had begun to provide humanitarian aid, medical supplies, and limited military assistance, while contemplating broader support in the event of Japanese aggression against Western nationals or property. Britain and France, concerned with their colonial interests in Asia, advocated for a cautious diplomatic stance, pressuring Tokyo to negotiate but avoiding direct military confrontation. International organizations, including the League of Nations, condemned Japanese aggression, though their influence was limited. Previous failures, such as the League's inability to halt the invasion of Manchuria in 1931, had weakened the organization's authority. Japan, confident in its military superiority and unconstrained by international enforcement mechanisms, ignored formal protests while continuing operations in occupied territories. By the middle of 1939, diplomatic tension escalated alongside the fighting. Chiang Kai-shek leveraged the humanitarian crisis and the resilience of Chinese forces to appeal directly to Western leaders. Radio broadcasts, international newspapers, and diplomatic correspondence emphasized the existential threat posed by Japanese expansion, the atrocities committed in cities like Nanjing, and the need for material and military support. Chiang's wife, Sung Mei-ling, continued to be a prominent advocate in the United States, delivering speeches that highlighted both the moral imperative and strategic interest of supporting China against Japanese aggression. Japan, for its part, sought to justify its actions through propaganda and diplomatic messaging. Tokyo emphasized the notion of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, presenting the war as a liberation of Asia from Western imperialism and Chinese mismanagement. Japanese officials argued that occupation would bring stability, modern infrastructure, and security, despite the reality of widespread destruction, massacres, and forced labor. Aggressive generals within the army, such as Matsui Iwane and Hisaichi Terauchi, remained determined to expand territorial control and suppress Chinese resistance at any cost, often sidelining more moderate voices within the Japanese government. As the conflict extended into 1940, skirmishes, sabotage, and localized battles intensified throughout the occupied territories. Guerrilla operations disrupted supply lines, ambushed convoys, and inflicted continual casualties on Japanese forces, undermining morale and tying down substantial troop numbers. The Japanese response included both conventional counterattacks and harsh punitive measures against civilian populations suspected of supporting resistance activities. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and populations forcibly relocated or executed, reinforcing Chinese resolve to resist and galvanizing international condemnation. In central and western China, major defensive operations continued to stabilize the front lines. Nationalist divisions fortified key cities, maintained riverine defenses, and coordinated with communist guerrillas to establish mutually supportive zones of control. Though tactical victories were rare, the combination of conventional and irregular warfare prevented Japanese forces from achieving decisive breakthroughs. The protracted struggle strained Japan's logistical capabilities and exposed the limits of its numerical and technological superiority. Diplomatic engagement became a parallel battlefield. The United States, while hesitant to commit directly to combat, increased arms shipments, facilitated Soviet-Chinese cooperation, and imposed economic sanctions on Japan in response to continued atrocities. Britain and France, wary of Japanese expansion yet constrained by commitments in Europe and North Africa, engaged in cautious diplomatic maneuvering, urging restraint while preparing contingency measures to protect colonies and trade routes in the Asia-Pacific region. By the end of 1940, the Second Sino-Japanese War had evolved from a series of localized clashes into a full-scale conflict with global implications. Japan controlled major eastern cities and key transportation routes, but the war was far from over. Chinese resistance, increasingly coordinated and persistent, demonstrated that occupation alone could not secure Japanese objectives. International diplomacy, while slow and often reactive, set the stage for further escalation, linking the Chinese struggle to the broader strategic dynamics that would soon culminate in the Pacific theater of World War II. The combination of sustained Chinese resistance, international aid, and the growing humanitarian crisis underscored the multidimensional nature of the conflict. The war had transcended the battlefield, encompassing diplomacy, propaganda, logistics, and international public opinion. As both sides adjusted to these realities, the trajectory of the Second Sino-Japanese War became a defining element of the emerging global conflict, shaping alliances, strategies, and the fate of millions of civilians caught in the struggle for survival and sovereignty. By 1941, The Second Sino-Japanese War had become an entrenched and protracted conflict, stretching across vast swaths of northern, central, and eastern China. The initial rapid advances of Japanese forces, characterized by decisive urban battles and overwhelming firepower, had given way to a grinding war of attrition. Despite Japan's control over major cities, railways, and coastal regions, the Chinese resistance proved remarkably resilient, utilizing both conventional and guerrilla warfare to frustrate Japanese objectives. In northern China, Japanese forces maintained a tenuous hold over key urban centers and strategic rail lines, but the countryside remained contested. Guerrilla units, often operating in small, mobile bands, harassed supply convoys, destroyed bridges, and conducted ambushes that inflicted steady losses. Civilians, though caught in the crossfire, provided intelligence, shelter, and logistical support to the resistance. In many regions, these local networks became essential to sustaining prolonged operations, allowing smaller Chinese forces to achieve disproportionate effects against numerically superior Japanese troops. Central China, including the Yangtze River Valley, remained a critical theater. Cities such as Wuhan, Chongqing, and Xiangyang were fortified and served as command centers for the nationalist government and military. The relocation of Chiang Kai-shek's government to Chongqing allowed for continuity of administration and coordination of military operations, even as Japanese aerial bombardments and artillery strikes inflicted heavy casualties. Chinese troops, bolstered by Soviet-supplied aircraft, artillery, and mechanized units, continued to slow Japanese advances, while German-trained divisions enhanced operational discipline and effectiveness. The prolonged struggle had significant humanitarian consequences. Millions of civilians were displaced, creating refugee crises in urban centers and remote areas alike. Disease, famine, and exposure compounded the hardships of war, while Japanese occupation policies, including forced labor, requisitioning of resources, and punitive massacres, intensified civilian suffering. Reports from the front lines, often smuggled to the international press, highlighted the scale of atrocities, galvanizing global public opinion and contributing to diplomatic pressure on Tokyo. International engagement remained a critical factor in sustaining Chinese resistance. The Soviet Union continued to supply arms, advisors, and pilots, ensuring that Chinese forces could field artillery, tanks, and aircraft to contest Japanese operations. The United States, though not yet at war in the Pacific, increased material assistance and maintained a network of intelligence and logistical support. Britain and France, while constrained by European commitments, monitored the situation closely, recognizing that the outcome of the conflict in China could affect the strategic balance in East Asia. By 1942, the war had evolved into a multi-dimensional struggle. Conventional battles, urban sieges, guerrilla operations, and strategic sabotage created a fluid battlefield where neither side could secure total control. Japanese troops faced growing logistical difficulties, stretched thin across occupied territories, and increasingly dependent on vulnerable supply lines. Chinese forces, leveraging local knowledge, natural terrain, and international support, continued to mount effective resistance despite disparities in training, equipment, and firepower. The expansion of the conflict into coastal regions and maritime approaches heightened the strategic stakes. Japanese forces sought to secure access to ports, control shipping lanes, and isolate inland Chinese regions. Naval and air operations became increasingly important, as both sides recognized the significance of controlling rivers, harbors, and supply routes. Allied observers noted that Japan's overstretched forces and limited ability to garrison conquered areas created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by coordinated resistance and future international intervention. The war's endurance also had profound political consequences. Regional warlords, previously semi-autonomous, were increasingly drawn into coordination with the nationalist government to resist Japanese advances. The tenuous alliance with communist forces persisted, marked by collaboration in key operations, while underlying ideological tensions remained unresolved. Public sentiment, fueled by reports of Japanese atrocities and propaganda emphasizing national unity, reinforced Chinese resolve to continue the struggle. The protracted nature of the conflict foreshadowed broader global implications. Japan's commitment of vast resources to China, coupled with the inability to secure decisive victories, weakened its position relative to other major powers. Western observers, noting the human and material costs of the war, debated intervention strategies, sanctions, and support for China. The conflict's trajectory increasingly intersected with global geopolitics, laying the groundwork for Japan's eventual confrontation with the United States and its allies in the Pacific. By the end of 1942, the Second Sino-Japanese War had transformed into a central element of the emerging world war in Asia. Japanese forces, though victorious in capturing cities and infrastructure, were unable to subdue the Chinese nation. Resistance persisted across urban and rural landscapes, bolstered by foreign aid and domestic determination. The war's expansion had created a complex, multi-dimensional battlefield, intertwining military operations, diplomacy, and civilian endurance. Historians later emphasized the strategic significance of China's prolonged resistance. By absorbing Japanese resources, tying down divisions, and maintaining operational pressure, Chinese forces indirectly shaped broader global events. The conflict demonstrated that even in the face of overwhelming military superiority, a determined and organized population, supported by international allies, could resist occupation and maintain the struggle for sovereignty. As the war continued, the stage was set for further escalation. Japan's ambitions in Asia, unchecked by decisive victories in China, would soon collide with Western powers, culminating in the Pacific theater of the Second World War. The resilience of China, the strategic calculations of Japan, and the interplay of international diplomacy during this period ensured that the Second Sino-Japanese War was not merely a regional conflict, but a critical precursor to global hostilities that would reshape the 20th century.